LPZZ. This is how it happened. This is how the 1/12th competition died. Since its pre-order launch back in, I want to say late 2023, early 2024, somewhere around that ballpark, this guy's been shown in several different shows overseas and some even here in the States. And there's been some kind of like refinements. It's popped up a couple of times where you can argue that maybe some of the sculpting has gone through some variable changes and they've been kind of remaining up to date as to what it is that they've been doing on social media. And now finally here we have the final product, finally making its way on over to collectors. Invoices are being fulfilled. And now thanks to the good folks over at Cowkeys.com, I was provided this sample here to try out and finally break down in a review fashion. So big ups to Cowkeys.com. I'll include links to their site and to the product page for this LPZZ Batman, which at the time of this recording is still available for pre-sale. So if you guys want to check that out, the link is going to be in the description as well as a pinned comment down below. And if you couldn't tell already right now why it is that this guy has been on so many people's radars as far as something that can finally break ground within the 1/12 scale community, is because an awful lot of companies have been getting a little complacent. Meanwhile, you have companies overseas that, sure, we are not terribly familiar with, but then they put out some kind of prototype saying, hey, here's an idea of what we can do. Let us cook. Let us actually make something for you and then taste it and tell us what you think. I'm getting a little hungry just thinking of this metaphor. And that's precisely what LPZZ, or I'm sorry, Upine Figures, set out to do. And they arguably chose probably the best thing they could produce as their first figure in this foray. Because you could argue that yes, we wish we could get other interpretations of Batman since Arkham Knight feels like it's been done a little to death. But you can almost argue from a business standpoint as to why it is that they chose Arkham Knight Batman. It's because there is already so much competition within the space for this portrayal of the character. Yeah, we really do wish of so many other portrayals and interpretations of Batman, not just within the Arkhamverse, but from the comics, etc. And it looks like LPZZ is going to start to roll those out in the foreseeable future. But for now, the Arkham Knight Batman could very well serve as a foundation, not only to serve as a competitor, but also to flex their muscles from both a color, paint, and sculpting manner. Because at the 1/12 scale format, which of course is going to be approximately 6 inches, so if you were thinking that this was going to scale for DC Multiverse from McFarlane, you're going to be mistaken. But if you are kind of matching the industry standard as far as scaling is concerned with those 6 inches, whether it be Marvel Legends or any of those competitors within the prosumer stage as far as Mafex, Figuarts, etc., or even Revoltech for that matter, this guy's more or less going to fit somewhere in there. There may be some proportioning that we're going to iron down and really truly compare when we get to that segment of the review, when we take a look at the competition and see them next to each other. But for now, I would say that within proportions, within scaling, this guy is doing a wonderment in the 1/12 scale format, because as far as the way that they were able to sculpt and tool everything together to fit, like I said, in a very proportioned state with the limbs, the torso, and the head. And unlike some other portrayals of the character, you can note that LPZZ opted for a much more monochromatic colorway, where you can tell that they didn't exactly adapt that bluish tint when it comes to certain parts of the suit, because they were trying to kind of factor in the cinematography from the game predominantly taking place at night. And of course, the neon and the lights bouncing off of the cityscape of Gotham. Batman often has that bluish tint on him, but you could tell when playing the game that it's a diegetic thing happening that's kind of bouncing off of his suit. Whereas here, LPZZ, it's almost like it's taking a photorealistic approach as far as coloring the scheme of the suit in a way that would be much more universal to whatever sort of light source you have around him, whatever environment you place him, whether it be in a detolf shelf or a case, etc. It's gonna be at home as far as what you can play around with the color scheming. So you can note that it's going for much more monochromatic colors as far as different scales of gray, black, silver, chrome, and something that's a bit more airbrush, whereas something else is kind of favoring more so on the gunmetal side, jet black, smoky, etc. All of those different factors of gray, black, and white is pretty much all alchemized here in the center. That ultimately is very, very pleasing to the eye. Everything as far as the paint applications is really good, but at the same time, it's making sure that everything feels like a very different piece from one to another. Parts of the paint look like they have shadows almost embedded into them, and part of that is also attributed to the sculpt, which, I gotta be honest, it's just way too good to be true. I'm just waiting for the shoe to drop, but there's so many different angles that I've taken a look at this guy where the sculpt, like I said, it's just too good to be true. I'm just waiting for some sort of curtain to drop for me to see the wizard behind said curtain and be like, oh no, that's exactly what they did. But so far, I would want to say that the sculpting is 98 to 99% there as far as really delivering on the way that the armor inside of the game truly looks. To me, some of my favorite parts would have to be areas around the limbs where maybe the plastic that's utilized here, a combination of I think it's POS, something like that, or ABS, PVC, etc., is tooled together in a way that feels a little familiar to some of the competition, predominantly Revoltech, as far as how some of the plastic around the limbs, specifically the thighs and the legs, truly feel. Not cheap, but it just has that familiar feel when you truly start to kind of futz and mess around with the figure. But as far as the sculpting is concerned, this is where you can tell that they decided to not go in the overly stylized direction like Amazing Yamaguchi, and instead go for something a bit more grounded and photorealistic, not too unlike the way that they designed some of those characters in the game by Rocksteady. So here you have an awful lot of that sort of crinkling and creasing happening with some of the fabrics and plushiness happening alongside the thighs, the biceps, but then of course an awful lot of that rigid panelized texture happening with the gauntlets, the little bits of little pieces that can technically move in-game around the shin guards, the back of the calves, the boots, and then predominantly around the gauntlets and the spikes there. But to me would have to be everything that has to do with the mid-torso here, predominantly the ab piece that is made out of this texture that feels really good in hand. They really outdid themselves as far as this really texturized grip feel to the abdominal pieces that are segmented here on the surface. That then leads us to the bat symbol, which also takes on this very segmented look like it did in the game, that is designed to then flex to allow the armor to spread across the chest and be malleable for him to be able to move in. So they replicated that look here that, of course, from a subjective point of view, it really depends on whether you favor this or the much cleaner look that he had in the prior Arkham games, but you can't deny that LPZZ here was able to do it one-to-one. Along with that, you have this, like I said, this much more semi-glossy airbrush gunmetal to the armorized chest piece that is housing the bat symbol. That, to me, at least makes it look different. Then, arguably, the only other area that I'll nitpick, which have to be these other chrome bits around the shoulders, the gauntlets, and the boots that are just a little too bright. I wish that they would kind of dull them down just a tad bit because they do kind of stand out a little bit too much, whereas in the game, they're definitely there. They're just much more muted and toned down, which is kind of ironic since we have the only area here that has some sort of different colorway that's a bit too toned down, and I wish that they would have done the opposite in brightening it up, which would have to be the utility belt, which is sculpted and modeled just like it is in the game as far as the much more narrowed down look to the buckle, but then the elongated pouches and kind of compartments on the side that are sculpted beautifully, but I wish that they would have played a little bit better with the color in that sense. But above that, we have a very nice example of another texture that's kind of holding everything together, which would have to be this kind of hexagonal mesh material that's also present in game, and it's kind of giving us some varying degrees of texture happening there, where you have a little bit of that creasing of the what is generally found as like blue plushy material on other figures, but here it's more so of like a mitigated gray next to the texturized abdominal pieces. But then you have, like I said, this hexagonal mesh that is connecting everything together and found underneath the plates, underneath the shoulder guards, a little bit here on the bicep, a little here on the thigh. That is, again, giving us a different sense of different moving parts for the mesh material that makes up the armor, while at the same time making it look a little bit more like a sense of Kevlar that is giving it an added layer of protection to the overall suit. And apart from that, the overall sculpt work at play here is absolutely beautiful. Minor, a couple of nitpicks, like I mentioned before, a little bit of brightness could have been added to the utility belt. I did have Well, you can argue a slight bit of a QC problem on mine, one that I thought was by design, only to then realize that it's not really present on both, which would have to be the spikes here on the gauntlets. One is absolutely beautiful and cannot complain whatsoever about, which would have to be the left one. But over on the right one, you'll notice that you have one spike that's a little bit on the dulled out side. So I kind of wish that that would have been a little more pointy to then kind of match a little bit of the uniformity for the rest of the spikes. So that could have been a little bit better cleaned up. But again, just nitpicks compared to the overall home run of the sculpt work at play here in regards to the rest of the armor. And while we're on the subject of really great details about the sculpt, we can't move past that absolute beauty of a head sculpt. Just look at that thing. It's amazing. Not only is the cowl retrofitted in the classic Arkham Knight style with the different segmentations of the panels that make up the armorized, or I should say motorized cowl that he puts on in the game, but then you have, of course, the elongated ears, save for a little bit of curvature happening on the left mine, but I feel like I can kind of warp that out a little bit by just giving it a little bit of massaging and pressing with the fingers. Apart from that, though, you can see that you even have additional of that hexagonal mesh material connecting the different panels and the segments of the cowl in and of itself. And then, to me, the piece de resistance would have to be the lifelike eyes and mouth plate that is sculpted with the mouth plate there having the right shade of skin tone that matches that of the Rocksteady design. But then you have very lifelike eyes that at one point I did think were just a little bit small on the pupil side, very similar to the recent Fonjoy Superman that I covered. But the saving grace behind the eyes on this guy is that he is a bit more scaled down. He is 1/12th as opposed to the 1/9th Fonjoy Corn Sweat Superman, and therefore the eyes over there looked a little bit too small, whereas here, especially when you take into account the white underneath the eyes and the functionality that we'll cover a little bit later on, it looks a bit more lifelike. And to me, I gotta be honest, this is one of the best head sculpts for any Arkham figure in this scale to date. Which then leads me to arguably the only part of the figure that I'm a little conflicted on, because overall I've been generally positive, as you can already tell, but the only area that I do think I'm a little split on would have to be this cape. Hear me out, because there's definitely some positives that are very seminal to this interpretation of the Arkham Knight figure in this format, in this scale. And that would have to be that I truly do appreciate their attempt at a mixed media style to their cape, where we have a fabric that I could be wrong on. I could most definitely be wrong on this one, but to the touch and in terms of flexibility, it almost feels a bit like spandex. Feels similar to the material that's utilized for like Under Armour, the kind of like workout armor shirts that you typically wear underneath your typical clothing. It feels like that's what they utilized here for the cape. I could be wrong. Again, I don't know my fabrics all too well. It's definitely some kind of felt good cape that is not nylon. I can almost rule out nylon here, so it could just simply be a very elastic cloth. But I almost want to lean towards the sides of it being a spandex of some kind. Something that is a bit more unique and I've never really felt before on a Batman figure, period. On top of that, you have a total of 5 wires, 2 on each end, as you can very note right there. One very strong one in the middle, but then you have an additional 2 just a few degrees off the sides of each end here. So you have a total of 5. Kind of wish that there would have been a 5th and a 6th one right in between right here to kind of close out this gap, but at the same time, the wires in and of themselves are really rigid and very firm to give you an awful lot of possibilities there as far as how you're able to futz with this cape. But it's during my futzing where I did run across a couple of problems. It is a little on the top heavy side as far as pulling down on the shoulder, especially when you take into consideration how it's sort of connected to the shoulder pieces here, because they did manage to sort of replicate the way that it's styled in the game, and I understand that this is technically game accurate, where they managed to sort of bring one of the wires and kind of encompass the back shoulder a little here to where it's supposed to fit right underneath the shoulder guard, very similar to the way it appears in game. And it's technically a function that you're going to have to fix right out of the box, because by default these shoulder pieces were actually on the lower part of the bicep. They're on this hinge, so they're definitely flexible and even articulated to an extent, but they came like this out of the box, so it looked a little awkward. But then that's when I realized that, oh, you're actually supposed to press them upwards and sort of cover up this section of the cape around his shoulder to then not only, like I said, mimic the look that he had in the game so that it favors gliding maneuverability, but at the same time, make him look a bit more natural when he's in a static pose, and also hold down the cape so that it's able to drape towards the sides back here. But even doing so kind of creates a little bit of a top heaviness effect because of how heavier those wires truly are. And if that wasn't already weighing the cape down a bit too much, you'll notice that you do have a little bit of mixed media happening on this top side of the cape, where they incorporated this rubberized piece grafted on top of the midsection of the cape, which is a cool little detail, albeit one that's not terribly game accurate. I went back and looked at some gameplay of Batman gliding amongst the skyline of Gotham City in the rain even, to kind of give me an idea of whether or not this piece is actually present, and from what I can tell, it's not really there. I could be wrong, but every time I looked at a screenshot or gameplay clip, I didn't see this piece there. So kudos to LPZZ for standing out and making the cape look a little bit more different, and I guess a bit more premium by association by including this little graft on top. But not only is it adding a few ounces of weight to the cape and making it a little bit top heavy and difficult to pose, but also it's attracting, for someone like me who's got overly perspiring hands, it is a major sweat magnet, and it's going to require an awful lot of wiping down to make sure that it doesn't receive any damage or just plainly looks ugly. And speaking of posability, let's tackle articulation, because that could definitely be another make or break for certain collectors who were looking to a very accurate and very photorealistic Arkham Knight Batman in 1/12 scale, only to then be disappointed by the articulation and rendering the figure into a glorified statue. We already have some competing companies that often fall into that crux. So it seems like someone over at LPZZ, or maybe the grand team that was working on this guy, thought of that ahead of time, because the articulation on this guy is actually pretty top notch. You have the head here that can definitely turn on the ball joint 360 degrees. Just mind a few of these collar and shoulder pieces that do get a little bit in the way via the design, so you're naturally going to have to tilt the head a little bit towards the top, which can definitely be done so in a very fluid fashion there via the ball joint, or tilted downwards like so. And then you have an additional neck sliding joint. It doesn't really rotate or nudge too much towards the sides, but it can definitely flex forward much more so like that. And to complement the overall visual look of the articulation for the neck, this collar piece towards the back even extends and presses down and kind of matches the movement of the neck joint. So that's pretty damn awesome. You even have some additional paint decal happening right there. So you can press that up and down and therefore flex the head in association up and down like so. It's one of the best feeling joints I've felt on an Arkham Knight Batman figure like so, and even a little bit side to side. Like I said, just mind a little bit of these neck guards that you can kind of see here off to the side, but otherwise you have great amount of movability here for the neck and head joint. As far as the arms, that was one little area of the figure that I was a little bit worried, considering that you have so much like armor stuff and paneling and things like that. But like I mentioned before, these shoulder guards are already on a hinge, so you can technically kind of move them and flex them in a way that fits to the pose that you want to put the arm in, which you can definitely do so by rotating the arm a full 360 degrees, no problem. Extend off to the sides almost at the full 180 degree like so, and you can allow the shoulder guards to kind of veer off a little bit off the waist to make sure that it complements it. And furthermore, not only do you have butterfly joints that can extend the arm forwards and back pretty favorably, as you can kind of see right there, shrugging motion up and down and kind of flex it side to side, that gives you an added look of the mesh material that I was mentioning before, sculpted into the texture and the surface. But this is weird. I don't know how often I'm going to use it, but LPZZ or Upine figures, whatever, they kept in mind some of the accurate looks and functionalities to the armor in the game, that if you want it to look accurate when it comes to him kind of crunching his shoulders forwards and to make the armor look a bit more photorealistic just like it did in the game, you can actually take these pieces of the chest armor and slide them inwards like so to make it look like this armor is moving in tandem with the arms. So you can kind of flex it like so to make it look like all this is flexing. So stop motion animators out there, you have an added little function here to favor some of the realism that you want to incorporate into those shots, because trust me, this is going to look mighty nice. The only little nitpick, which is truly just a nitpick, is that sometimes it does kind of give me this feel like, oh, did I break the armor? But no, it technically does move. It is functioned to then slide inwards and outwards. Just mind a little bit of the delicateness of that armor piece to make sure that you don't break it off its hinges, because you just have to be very, very careful, be very, very slow in sliding it inwards and outwards, because I had a couple of scares already myself, but it's definitely there to be able to favor some of those looks. And then moving on down to the arms, you of course have bicep swivels that can technically allow the bicep to rotate the full 360. In fact, you can do so towards the outsides right here. Just mind a little bit of the armor plating as well as the shoulder guards on top right here. 2 elbow joints that can technically bend the elbows all the way up. Mine are just a little bit on the stiff side, but the functionality is still found there. And then of course you're going to have wrist joints that allow the hand to fully rotate 360 degrees as well as bend inwards and outwards. The bending inwards and outwards could be a bit more favorable, but it's still serviceable there as it is. We do hit a slight snag when it comes to the mid-torso articulation, because unfortunately the mid-torso cut that you do have underneath the first set of ab pieces right there, unfortunately does not rotate. I already gave it my best shot without risk breaking the figure, so no type of 360 mid-torso rotation, but there's definitely a good amount of crunching forwards and back. There's just no oblique crunching side to side or rotation. It's strictly vertical, up and down, as you can kind of see right there. If you do want rotation, you're gonna have to rely on a little bit of waist movement found right there that is a little on the delicate side, and if anything, I'm a little scared to move it a little bit too far, but you can definitely see that it can kind of nudge side to side. So the overall torso articulation is a little on the slightly disappointing side. I do kind of wish I could flex a little bit more naturally. Same thing when it comes to crunching on the oblique side to side. You do get some added crunching on the waist, especially towards the front, because when you kind of flex it towards the back, there is a bit of a floatiness to the belt here towards the front, where you can see kind of like the belt floating on top of the crotch piece because of this little gap that is generated there. So I do kind of wish that this overall belt loop would have been tooled a little bit more flush to the crotch piece to not allow that to happen. It's just a little, it's because of how great everything is as far as the sculptor is concerned, that this just stood out to me a little bit. And I understand for why that's there. The reason for why this loop is kind of placed or adhered to the crotch piece the way that it is because technically speaking, these pieces here on the side with the compartments and the pouches that are a little bit on the elongated side vertically, they're actually removable via a peg right here, and they're still attached towards the back, but via that attachment on the back side, they can technically move and nudge up and down. Not too unlike the amazing Yamaguchi Revoltic, where you have these pieces that are floating up and down. They kind of adopted the same sort of methodology here. And in doing so, this allows for the top leg joints to then flex a little bit more favorably towards the top like so, and then towards the back like that. Flexing towards the back could have been a little nicer since the butt sculpt is kind of getting in the way right there, but then you'll notice that they did kind of go for something a little bit different as far as the pieces on the inside that allows the flexing of the extension towards the sides right there that can only be done via the, again, like I mentioned before, these compartments on the belt be articulated to a degree so that it can move out of the way like so. And then when you're ready to put them in a neutral position, you can then take the pegs and fit them back into the holes next to the sides of the buckle. So it's kind of interesting that they borrowed that idea, only this time they didn't allow full segmentation to where they just kind of break away. You still have a little bit of the belt right there to at least clean up the look and still make it look like it's part of one holistic belt, as opposed to the amazing Yamaguchi where, yeah, the pieces rotate, but then you have this ugly break between the buckle in the center and then the rest right here. There's like nothing in between. Right underneath the top leg joint, you do have a slight thigh swivel, though it could have been a little on the better side. It can only kind of nudge side to side like so right there. But at least underneath that, you have really good knee joints that can flex all the way up like so. 2 full mobility right there, and pinless joints, so no pins to be found there. I do kind of wish that the ankle joints were a little bit better because they can technically pivot downwards like so by extending and flexing the ball joint towards the front just a little bit better like so. And then when you take the ball joint and then shift it towards the back, you can then pivot the foot and incline it upwards like so. But speaking of incline, it can't really pivot inwards, or rather outwards is where it's a little bit on the limited side. Pivoting inwards is not too bad. And then, of course, rotating all the way around, you kind of have to futz with it a little bit to then press past these like ankle armor pieces connected to the shin guard that are made out of a rubberized plastic, so they allow a little bit of give way to flex out of the way to allow you to rotate the foot. But on the bright side, you do get some toesies, just like with McFarlane, although they don't flex as much as I would have liked, but at the same time, it's the toes. I rather focus on the ankles being a bit more fluid to at least make me a little bit less worried about the top heaviness of the cape that I mentioned before. But when you do get those ankles to then work, and even in a natural pose, in a very static pose like so, my God, this right here just looks awesome in and of itself. Just having be brooding and just kind of standing over a building like so. It's all about, as the kids like to say these days, that aura that you can deliver with the perfect sculpt. But of course, now being a newish competitor in the prosumer space, as far as a figure that is going a little above and beyond as far as price range is concerned for your typical collector, they need to be able to match that value with the accessories. Of course, with a Batman like this, you're going to come with an awful lot of hand accessories. By default, he's got the fisted hands, but on the side, you're going to have symmetrical sort of reaching out hands. You're going to have batarang holding pinching hands, the trigger hands that are going to be favoring a good assortment of gadgetry that he comes included with. And then you also have like 2 extra pairs of gripping hands, and even the box and the description sort of lists them as simply just being gripping hands 1 and gripping hands 2. There's a little bit of change to the orientation of the fingers, but at the end of the day, they're both sort of gripping in a similar style. They just kind of slightly change up a little bit of the directions for the main 3 fingers, as opposed to the main index finger being a little higher or a little lower. So your guess is as good as mine as to which one is specific to which gadget. But there's no mistaking that the pinching hands are going to be for 2 included batarangs that are decently painted as far as the little chrome accents you have on the blades right there on the side. And then, of course, the middle part is going to be designed after that very iconic look that Rocksteady made for themselves inside of the Arkham games. So you have 2 inclusions there, albeit they're a little on the thin side, so do be careful because they are very prone to breaking. And speaking of 2 of the same gadget, you do get technically 2 line launchers, 2 zip liners right here. They don't necessarily function. They don't really have any kind of like articulation to them as far as these pieces separating or moving, but similar to the Batarang, they're decked out with black and chrome paint, or semi-glossy chrome paint right there. So not too bad. Can't complain about them too much. But there's a reason for why I'm about to slightly breeze through some of these gadgets that are included. Some of which are Arkham staples, like the explosive gel gun right there, as well as the grapnel, complete with a very fine-tooth combed grapnel hook there at the front. But you have, of course, like I mentioned before, that Arkham style to the handle and the little spool that you have there connecting the 2 pieces, as well as the little barrel here towards the front. Again, very emblematic of the Arkham series, the Arkhamverse. But then you have 2 very specific gadgets for Arkham Knight in particular. You have the voice synthesizer, which is pretty much this device with what almost looks like a Dremel here towards the front, but it's designed to then, of course, replicate different frequencies of a character's voice so that Batman can then get past some certain security clearances. And then you have what I always thought looked like a glorified but very pacifistic looking LMG, but I know that it's not. It's simply just the disruptor there for different functionalities that Batman can utilize it with. But to me, it always looked like a 50 cal or an LMG. Again, I don't know my guns, but it just looks like a very heavy metal, a heavy duty rifle, complete with compartments for the ammo right here. But of course, that's not necessarily what it's for. There's a part of me that almost kind of wishes that it would have been articulated here in the center, where you can very clearly make out a hinge. So it would have been nice if maybe that piece would have been articulated to make it look like it's functionable. But again, it's simply just a rigid piece right there for posability and for showcases to make them look cool. But the reason for why I was sort of breezing through some of this gadgetry is because there is a little bit of an enveloping complaint that I do have about them, which is that they are very monochromatic to a fault. I understand that that kind of favors the sculpt work happening with the main body of the figure itself, But when it comes to the accessories, they're okay. You know, they don't really stand out too much because you can only cover the explosive gel gun or the batarangs or the grapnel so many times that you kind of wish that some of these companies would do something a little clever with the sculpt work or functionality or at least at the very bare minimum, paint decals. And that's, I think, one of the things that sort of feels like a little bit of a letdown with these accessories is that they're all just black and gray. I kind of wish that they would have played a little bit with little decals, a little bit of brown, a little bit of copper, some yellow, something bluish sprinkled in there. You can maybe make the argument that they saved that for what they call pre-order bonus accessories, which are included in this nice little dime bag. Yes, that's what I called it. And those pre-order bonuses come in the form of not only one, not two, but 3 sonar batarangs. And effectively, they're very similar to the default batarangs, only they are much bigger, which is kind of strange considering that they're sculpted about the same, complete with the little chrome blade here on the sides, the very iconic look to the batarangs from the Arkhamverse. But you'll notice that they have these color-coded little bubbles in the center. One is blue, one is green, and then the other one's kind of orangey red. Cool, but I could have, at best, I could have maybe taken just the blue one and that's it, because I understand that there were different functions to the sonar batarangs. One was like remote controlled, the other one was explosive, etc. But in terms of having it here in figure, this is just giving me more to look out for and making sure that I don't lose. So, I wish that they were a bit more playful. And then on top of that, the last pre-order bonus accessory is this freeze grenade, which is very nicely painted and sculpted, very reminiscent of the freeze grenade that made its first appearance back in Arkham City. I kind of wish that this would have been included with the figure already, as opposed to being a pre-order bonus. Plus, I gotta be honest, I don't know what we're calling these pre-order bonuses because they kind of remind me of the pre-order bonuses that you would get when you pre-ordered, quote-unquote, a video game. Even though those bonuses, those downloadable pieces of content are included in a voucher in the box, which means all I have to really do is buy the figure, or I guess in that analogy, buy the game day one, and it's still included even though I technically didn't pre-order. You know what I mean? Like, a pre-order bonus should feel like a pre-order bonus. Here, it just feels like something that you could have just included with the standard version of the box, and now they're simply just going to cut it out past the first batch or past the first month of this release. It's like, you might as well just leave it in there, you know what I mean? And apart from the aforementioned pinching hands that fit the batarang pretty snug, there was something about the rest of the gripping hands as well as the trigger hands that didn't quite mesh very well with the rest of the gadgets. I don't know if they were like sculpted at different faces, but I had a tough time sort of orienting which hand went with which gadget. Some of the zip liners didn't really fit well with some of the gripping hands around the handle, or the gel gun kind of slid through one of the differently oriented hands. So your guess is as good as mine as to which one's going to be favoring the other. It's going to be overall a trial and error process that may not look all too visually pleasing when it comes to certain poses. However, those aren't what I like to call the game changers as far as accessories, as far as what LPZZ or Upine figures could include in the box to set themselves apart. They also included these two, they almost feel like metal rods, but I think they're just a very durable form of plastic with nice little texture work happening there. But there's not really any real function for them as far as an accessory is concerned. They're simply just tools, these two metal rods right here. And the reason for why they included these two is because you're supposed to use these two rods to then be able to articulate the biggest function within this cowled sculpt, which is the fact that you're able to take the front piece here, remove it, and then move the eyes. He's got, just like Hot Toys, you got separate eye rolling systems. And I'm not saying that they're the first ones to do this. Of course, like I mentioned before on the channel, you had Amazing Yamaguchi Revoltech with this functionality. But I'm sorry, I'm just gonna say it out front. This is implemented much better than Revoltech, because you can take these two rods and place them much more firmly, as opposed to having to like dig inside of the head sculpt. You can actually take just this front panel of the head sculpt of the cowl, remove it, and that gives you very much more direct access to the eyeballs. It feels much more comfortable. It doesn't feel like I'm about to press it too far in either direction. It doesn't feel like I'm gonna break anything, and I can actually orientate and articulate the eyeballs properly. Save for a couple of instances where the eyeballs did pop out by accident, but as long as you're kind of giving it a twist when removing the rod, that way you don't risk popping the eyeballs too frequently, the process of moving these eyes is just much more fluid than that of the Revoltechs. And then to complement this function, you have an additional mouth plate. This time it's sculpted with a grimace to make it look like he's either taking a punch or delivering one. And similar to some other figures that have had this function, I think Amazing Yamaguchi is very similar to this, except his whole faceplate comes off as opposed to simply just the mouth plate here. All you have to really do is remove the head sculpt, and then utilizing, once again, one of these tools to then move the eyeballs, you can then poke the default mouth plate out and then pop this one back in, completing the overall image. So just imagine the possibilities of either doing a general scowl here for the default mouth plate, or the grimace one, moving the eyeballs about. Or if you want to take it a step further, something that of course I was not able to resist in doing, which is to then roll the eyeballs completely up to give them an all-white look. Very reminiscent of the animated series or the classic comic books. And frankly, if anything, it looks much more terrifying than he did in the game. And to me, it just looks awesome. It completes the image. And even when you have the eyes actually present and in view, it just makes the overall head sculpt just look much more alive than any of the competition. No question. But wait! There is in fact still more, because it seems like the folks at LPZZ, they are not only Batman fans, but they probably played at the game as many times as some of us collectors have done so. And they know that one of the more iconic images from the game is, technically speaking, one of the more spoilery ones, which would have to be the inclusion of an alternate Bruce Wayne head sculpt, one that they decided to cut the middleman for, since they know that at this point a lot of third-party companies or some customized sculptors out there have already 3D printed their own head sculpt to mimic that of his appearance in the game via the new engine that Rocksteady was implementing in Arkham Knight. And here, after some initial scares of the softening of the texture and the changing of the sculpt and the expression, they finally delivered what I think is probably one of the best looking Bruce Wayne head sculpts in the scale, at least from the Arkhamverse, because to me, the paint applications is very similar to that of the mouth plate, so arguably it's going to have the correct skin tone, you have the correct hair sculpt there, the eyes feel very much alive. Unfortunately, no eyeball rolling system on this guy. That would have been a little bit too much of a stretch, but at the same time, that's fine. Albeit, I'm not the biggest fan of the little streaks of hair that they painted here by the hairline. At first, I thought that was a bit of a defect, but then I took a look at some photos online, and it turns out that that's actually intended, so it's a bright side to note that it's not a QC problem, but at the same time, on a much more subjective level, I kind of wish that they would have not resorted to including that, because I don't know, it just looks a little ugly to me. It looks like there is a QC problem there, and that's not necessarily the case. So that's something that they could have helped, because the hair is already sculpted very beautifully. They didn't really have to go a little bit too far with it. Nevertheless, though, the sculpt work on the face right there, it's definitely the kind of head sculpt that, even having the cowl sculpt, I would still mess around with this head, Bruce Wayne head, and swap it. That's arguably what the functionality of an alternate head sculpt should be, is that it should give incentive to the collector to then play around with and swap it in and out, in and out, in and out. And I'm definitely feeling that with this Bruce Wayne head sculpt, especially when you have the possibility of posing it with the empty cowl that is also included here to replicate a few of those shots from the ending of the game. And it's perfect, because at first I wasn't necessarily sold on the separation of the bottom piece here towards the bottom of the empty cowl, which is sculpted pretty decently as far as the way that it's kind of very similar to that of the default one. But what really sold me and even made me smile a bit was noting that if you look a little carefully, they separated the panels almost like it's mid-transformation, similar to like it is in-game. I think that's pretty badass. I love the inclusion of the mesh material there in between the panels. So this is definitely the type of empty cowl that will definitely favor certain poses to make him look like he's about to put it on, so you can kind of fit him halfway. And this little separation here towards the bottom favors that, because then he can kind of fit a little bit of the Bruce Wayne nose and mouth right in there to make it look like it's mid-transformation, about to be put on his head. And it's borderline perfect. In the last few inclusions in the box, you have the hexagonal base here with the Batman Arkham Knight logo there on the top, as well as a articulated arm, which is pretty standard. It's got the general points of articulation to be able to favor certain poses, the little grip here on the center. Albeit, from day one, I thought it was really strange that on the nameplate it says Arkham Knight, as opposed to simply just Batman. I don't understand why that's there. To the point where I think even LPZZ knew this and decided to incorporate a removable function of the nameplate. So you can technically remove that. So I don't know if that's supposed to be an admission that they screwed it up and they're leaving it to modders or 3D printers to be able to create their own little nameplate to put on top of that, because that should read Batman. It shouldn't. You already have the Batman Arkham Knight logo on top. I don't know why on the front it says Arkham Knight. And I understand that they got their own Arkham Knight coming out here in the future. They're still in the prototype stage. But at the same time, I don't know. They had plenty of time. This was on the prototype pictures. I don't know why they didn't necessarily fix that or fix the typos that are on the manual for that matter. I'm sorry, guys, but a little bit of proofreading goes a long way. You do get this added insert to let you know exactly what you could do with some of the functionality behind the eyeball rolling system, the replaceable heads, the articulation, what's included in the box. But it was pretty funny going through the list of the table of contents and seeing things like Compty helmet or removable Bruce Wayne head sculpt. Yeah, guys, we have, ChatGPT to help you with the proofreading. Also included, you have, of course, the little advert to let us know that entry number 2 in the series is going to be Deathstroke, which you can pre-order now. But as you can kind of see before you're here, even with the quote-unquote pre-order bonuses withstanding, there is arguably a really good amount of value included here already. Albeit there are a couple of little accessories here and there that I kind of wish that they would have included, such as what I would like to coin as the Oracle hand. So like a right hand with the 2 fingers extended to make it look like he's talking to Oracle via the cowl. That would have been a nice little inclusion that LPZZ could have broken ground on. But what has already been brought to us in 1/12 scale would have to be the decryptor with these holographic cards. And of course, I'm talking about Revoltech, who were able to include that with them. That's the one point that I will give them on, is the fact that they managed to bring us a decryptor, and to see it be completely absent from the LPZZ version is a little disorienting. But if we are gonna be fully disoriented as far as comparisons, distinctions, and argue over amongst ourselves which one is the best Arkham Knight Batman, we have to bring in the aforementioned Revoltech Amazing Yamaguchi, and then for shits and giggles, the McFarlane toys. And I feel like this is going to be the bulk of what could be competitive within this space, or at least within this scale, between the two companies, even though it's not the complete set to really be fair, because I understand that there's, technically speaking, one missing amongst the Arkham Knight Batman within this scale, and that's going to be the PlayArts Kai interpretation that was recently brought to my attention by one of my viewers of the channel. Shout out to him. But unfortunately, he's going for way too much in the aftermarket right now, and I ran out of time to fit him into this comparison. So we're just going to have to make do with the 3 principal ones here. Of course, the LPZZ, but then the other 2 that are probably at the brunt of the discussion as far as the focus of the debate. And that's going to be Amazing Yamaguchi / Revoltech or the McFarlane. Let's tackle probably the easiest one to get out of the way, which is going to be the McFarlane, because there's only so much what $20 can get you. And I strictly do say $20 because we have to keep in mind that at the time of its release, MSRP was in fact $20. We're talking about a release date of roughly, I want to say, I don't think it was even 2020. I want to give it the benefit of the doubt and say 2021, somewhere in like the first half of that 2021 year. For that price tag, you truly do get what you pay for, but I don't necessarily mean that as an insult. You get some decent sculpting, some decent interpretation, or I want to say conveying of what is interpreted on screen inside of the game, as far as the mesh material, the plating of the armor, the different shoulder guards, the shin guards. In my experience of owning this figure for the past couple of years, I would say that for $20 flat, not $22.99, $24.99 like it is right now, flat $20 apart from the included accessories. And again, the scale may not float everybody's boat, but at the same time, you're getting an awful lot of good sculpting as far as the armor around the shin guards, the solid nature of the torso. Even though you're sacrificing a mid-torso joint or any kind of rocker or swiveling, you're going to have to settle for the waist joint for that. But at the same time, you have a really good amount of movability as far as the articulation is concerned, even if it feels a little lanky and strange as far as the way that the ankles are tooled together. That makes balancing the figure, along with the already top-heavy rubberized cape, a little bit of a chore. But at least you get a solid head sculpt, good paint behind the eyes that feel very stark and very, menacing to say the least, and a really great head sculpt as far as the way that they etched out the cowl with really strong pointy ears on top of that are very reminiscent of the Arkham Knight suit. So as far as what, again, the value proposition is being taken into account, I would say that the McFarlane is not about outing, at least for the time of its release. But it's definitely something that is just, there's going to be a very stark difference of what $20 versus, I guess you could say from MSRP, $60 to $65 can get you. But at the same time, we have to factor in just how much a company, when really locked in, when focusing, can get as far as their sculpting practices, as far as their design teams thinking outside of the box and not trying to mass produce like crazy. And that's exactly what the LPZZ can get you. I would probably say that the only thing that you can find in the McFarlane versus the LPZZ is, like I mentioned before, that little bluish tint to some of the plushy material around the biceps and the thighs, and maybe a strong, bolder saturation to the utility belt, but at the same time, you're lacking the detail, you're lacking those little extra accents, and then, of course, you're dealing with a sculpt and with a figure that only $20 can net you. So I'm feeling pretty confident that the majority of the conversation is going to be around these two, the Amazing Yamaguchi / Revoltech compared to the LPZZ. But even then, there's still going to be so many stark contrasts that it's just going to be very difficult to really pit these two together without bringing in style, subjectivity, preference into the conversation, because Amazing Yamaguchi, like I mentioned, not just with the Arkham Knight and Batman here, but also with their spider armor or armorized Mark II Spider-Man that came out, I want to say I don't think it was even last year, I think it was somewhere in 2023, which was in fact covered on this channel. They're going for style, they're going for exaggeration, they're going for something that is reminiscent of an anime, kind of a convergence of anime and comic book aesthetics to then fit into this outlook of the characters. They've tackled that with Marvel in the form of Spider-Man, but also other Spider-Man related characters like I think Venomized Gwen when she was Spider-Gwen, something like that. And then most recently they reissued their Agent Venom. And now within the DC universe, you had, I think, that Hush Joker, or that comic-based Joker with the very exaggerated proportions of the legs. Again, they're going for very style. They're going for something that leaps out of a manga page. And I feel like the Revoltech Arkham Knight Batman here is no exception, with the exaggerated proportions of the legs, how girthy those thighs look, but then how stubby the shin guards look. I guess in terms of proportions and style, it really just depends if you're going for something that's catering to the more photorealistic, which is what LPZZ set out to do, versus the style in the Amazing Yamaguchi, and if you want to go for that very fluidity of that dynamic possibility that they offer as far as those aesthetics, which is why I would argue that for my money, for my dollar, yes, the complex sculpting and paintwork at play for the head sculpt on the LPZZ, UP, Fine Figures, whatever their name is now, is most definitely the better sculpt as far as actually nailing the skin tone, nailing the proportions of the mouth, the believability behind the eyes, as opposed to the beadiness and exaggeration of the overall mouth shape, as well as the very pale skin tone for the complexion found underneath the cowl in the Amazing Yamaguchi. So obviously they're catering to something that's just a bit more on the cartoony side. Like I said, something that's meant to look a bit more animated. Granted, I'll give Amazing Yamaguchi some simple little flowers for the sake of nailing some of those little rivets and gears and moving parts that make up the Arkham Knight Batsuit, as far as the pieces on the side of the chest symbol that can actually extend whenever you move the arms, so they kind of move in tandem with them. And you could argue that this kind of lends to this form of animation within the figure, whereas over here you have to do it as a separate piece. But at the same time, that gives the collector agency if you want to leave those pieces alone or if you want to give them a little bit of animation so they separate the two. For my money, I actually kind of prefer that, whereas over here, there might be a different collector who does like that the pieces move with the arm so they don't have to think of it after the fact. But you'll note that the shoulder guards are already coming off because they didn't do the best job of adhering the glue that's holding them in place. That combined with the encumbrant cape that, sure, I was giving some criticisms towards the tailoring of the cape for the LPZZ being a little bit on the top heavy side, but it doesn't come even close to just how unmanageable the Amazing Yamaguchi one really is, especially with the very flaky sort of pleather coated on the over on the top side of the cape that I just practically could have done without. At least over on the LPZZ, they went with just a simple rubberized graft on top that's just in the middle, and that combined with the much stronger wires is just ultimately making for a better cape. But like I mentioned before, they're going for that style. They're going for the exaggeration of the buckle. You have some much better pronunciation of that gold copper around the utility belt, better than that of the LPZZ, like I mentioned before. And you do have that bluish tint that's very reminiscent of the McFarlane as opposed to the LPZZ, which then again kind of brings a much more monochromatic flavor to their aesthetic. But at that point, it's because it's going for photorealism as opposed to this. So you'll notice the height difference, you'll notice the stubbiness, and sure, when in poses, especially the ones that are a bit more on the stylistic side, so to where he's like throwing the batarang, or it looks like he's gliding, or he's doing something crazy, that's where the Revoltech really plays at its strengths. But you'll see right here that there's just so many areas that it just doesn't come close to the LPZZ, especially when it comes to that abdominal armor that has the textured feeling on the surface, the little bits of, like I mentioned before, the gears and the rivets, the much more proportion-based biceps that don't look like they're swollen, or he's taking roids of that matter. And as I mentioned in that original review, you actually have articulation that is a bit more fun to play with. You have some better joints and better fluidity happening with the LPZZ as opposed to some good mobility within the joints themselves for the Amazing Yamaguchi. It's just the way that they're cut and tooled together, specifically those knee joints where they're kind of at a slant, so it's bending the lower leg in like a diagonal direction, or the stuff that's going on with the biceps, the ball joints that they utilized for the elbow joints that just makes it a little bit frustrating to do any kind of swiveling action, combined with the fact that whenever you move the arm, sure, it's moving the chest armor, but it's also getting frustrated with the cape, that at least I feel like I have much more better agency with the LPZZ. Even the accessories are very indicative of what you're paying for amongst the three. The most common accessory is naturally going to be the batarang, as you can kind of see right here, which I find pretty ironic that the LPZZ comes with the smallest one, but arguably the most decked out with a little bit of chrome there on the blades. And of course, all three are going to have that very iconic staple for the design of the Arkhamverse batarangs. Naturally, the McFarlane's going to be the girthiest one, but I do appreciate the little design in the middle for the bat symbol to make sure that it's clearly branded there. And I do find it that the Amazing Yamaguchi, despite being the smaller figure, has the larger batarang compared to that of the LPZZs. And if anything, it's probably the only area that the LPZZ comes out on the last spot, considering that the batarang, despite having better paint applications, I do find it just a little bit on the delicate side. I kind of wish that it was somewhere closer to that of the sizing for the Amazing Yamaguchi. But at the same time, like I said, you're lacking a little bit of that attention to detail amongst that one. Whereas the McFarlane, it's not bad. I mean, like I said, it kind of favors the actual target demographic of what we're dealing with as far as a $20 figure. So it's naturally the figure that could either be collected or be given to a child that really loves Batman and probably played some of the Arkham games. And naturally, this batarang is going to be able to withstand some of that very tough environment as far as tossing and turning and flipping and being thrown about. Once you move on past the batarang, you then get into some mix and match allocations of the accessories. So for example, the explosive gel gun can only really be found between either the LPZZ or even, in this case, the McFarlane. And similar to that of the Batarang, you can very clearly make out the differences here as far as the enlargement of the McFarlane, but the lacking of the detail and the paint applications that can only be found on the LPZZ. But missing from the McFarlane is going to be the Sonar Batarang, which can also be found on the Amazing Yamaguchi. And again, this is another strange one that I would give the slight win to Revoltech, because I do appreciate the slight glossy nature or the very reflective nature of the blue symbol, the little sphere there on the center for the Sonar Batarang. I do prefer that a little bit. I think it feels a little bit more quality and a bit more premium than that of the LPZZ, even though it is a little on the larger side. Like I said, I found it kind of bewildering that the bonus pre-orderable Sonar Batarangs that are included on this version of the UP Fine Figures version happens to have this simply painted on blue button there on the center that is just a simple paint application. Again, I appreciate the chrome aesthetic on the wings, but I think that Revoltech was able to nail the Sonar Batarang that feels just a bit more special in this case. And frankly, the only other thing that I can compare between these two as far as accessories that are a bit common amongst the three to compare would probably be the Grimace, except they have, of course, approached different methods to give us the different expression for Batman with the Grimace. On the LPZZ, you simply just have a mouth plate that you can swap out as opposed to the entire piece, whereas the Amazing Yamaguchi opted in for an entire front faceplate that comes with the rolling eyeball system, so it's duplicated here. But at the same time, it's still carrying on over that exaggerated proportion, that exaggerated sort of anime style to the facial expressions. So at this point, again, here they were able to go for a much more photorealistic approach. And beyond this point, it really does become a bit of a mix and match as far as what's included in the box and also for how much money you're really paying for it. For example, the McFarlane only really comes with, of course, the trading card, the base, and then the electro device, the one that shoots out the little electromagnetized pieces to be able to open the doors. Whereas the Revoltech does come with the one accessory that I give it credit for, which would have to be the decryptor. Not just one that's closed off, but also the deployed one that you can then pose with, along with the little adapter that can hold up the little holographic cards that are a grand total of 5 to swap out in. Like I said, my personal favorite would have to be the password decryptor holographic card because of all those goddamn Riddler trophies, but it does kind of add a little bit of shelf presence to the Amazing Yamaguchi with those, and it's one of the missed opportunities that the LPZZ missed out on. But if it means that in its stead we get a beautiful Bruce Wayne unmasked head sculpt complete with also an empty cowl that he can pose with, then that's a sacrifice that I'm most definitely willing to make. And that, combined with the beautiful detail on the body itself, the cape, despite, again, my nitpicks and criticisms, not just for the cape, but also for the figure itself, as far as a couple of missed opportunities with the articulation, as much as I tried to divert around it, there was no other way to properly slice this fruit except for the only way to know how, which is that LPZZ or UP Fine-Gures, however they want to go about these days, they most definitely raised the standard for what could be developed in this scale. And in a time where certain businesses and companies, like I mentioned before, are getting a little too complacent, companies overseas like LPZZ/UP Fine-Gures is really putting an awful lot of companies in their place, because at this point, there really is no excuse. And despite a couple of things that it came out short on, there was no other rating that I can think of giving the LPZZ Arkham Knight Batman than a very strong and solid and very eclectic 9 out of 10. Not only is it a very first great impression by the company for their first figure release, but it's also one of my favorites of the year, possible contender for figure of the year by the time the 2025 rolls out. And it makes me look all the more forward to its sophomore outing in the form of that Arkham Knight Deathstroke. Once those prototypes finally get painted and articulated, whatever they got cooking for the Arkham Knight, as well as the Catwoman, as well as, of course, other things that they've been kind of teasing at as of late, whether it be stuff from the Snyderverse, in particular the BBS Batman, as well as his Batmobile, and then, of course, if they're doing Batmobiles, whether they are full-blown vehicles or model kits, the sky is the limit of what they can kind of procure later in the future. Arguably, an Arkham Knight Batmobile, since they've already released this guy along with Deathstroke, is probably in the cards, and it would be, like I said, a great missed opportunity if they don't act on that very, very quickly, especially when we're still waiting on some other companies to deliver on their own Arkham Knight Batmobile or Arkhamverse Batmobile of some kind, in terms of something that could be affordable within this range. And LPZZ could tap into that market. And I'm not saying that it needs to be monopolized by them. I'm looking at you, InArt. I'm looking at you, Sawtooth. I'm looking at other third-party companies and other places overseas that can definitely be giving some competition to the market. And I'm looking forward to it because Lord knows that we need it at this point. And even though it already goes without saying, I cannot recommend the LPZZ Batman enough. If you have some kind of opportunity to procure it, which I understand is a little on the difficult side right now with the whole stuff that's happening with the tariffs, certain packages overseas are being held up. If there's some kind of method, as long as it's within reason, because I understand that scalpers out there are going to take great advantage and make sure that you gauge it correctly. Don't pay more than what you need to, because like I mentioned before, this guy retails for somewhere between $70 to $80. Maybe it kind of rounds up to about an even $100 or so with the shipping and the handling. But if you guys do want to check out a place that still has it available for pre-order, you can procure it over at calkeys.com. The link again is going to be in the description or as a pinned comment, and you guys can check them out. And if you guys have any kind of like wish list or anything that you would like to see LPZZ or UP find yours to tackle next, apart from what they've already teased as far as the Deathstroke, the BVS Batman, if they were to tackle maybe even Superman or Wonder Woman or other comic book characters, let me know down in the comment section which one you guys would like to have seen, because at this point I feel like they are probably fans of Batman as much as we are, and they're probably going to be checking out some of these videos. So make your voices be known in the comment section below, and while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, stay humble, and I'll catch you later.